Hi, I'm Bradley Hastings. I'm the Director of Executive Education at the John Grill Institute of Project Leadership at the University of Sydney. It's my pleasure to talk to you today about one of my most favourite topics. But before I do so, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining and recording this presentation on the Gadigal lands, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Also acknowledge Indigenous teachings and stories which have been handed down for thousands of generations, some of which that we're only just beginning to understand the powerfulness of in the context of leadership. And some of these actually relate to the themes that I'm going to touch on today. So this question, what is the right stuff? What is the secret sauce of leadership? This is something I get asked in my role quite a lot. And I'm fascinated by this question because people, when they're asking it, they seem to be looking for that extra thing, the extra thing that they can add on to their organization in order to make their leaders more effective and therefore their organizations more effective. I think this question is only half of the story. There's another half of this question, which is not just what's the extra stuff that I need to do, but what's the stuff we need to let go of? What are the zombie ideas of leadership that are walking amongst us? What I mean by zombie ideas are the dead ideas about leadership, which are still alive and well and walking amongst our organizations. So to me, this question is better served in two parts. What are those zombie ideas? And how do we get rid of them? As well as what is the new stuff that we need to embrace? And this is my central provocation to you in listening to this presentation. What are the zombie leadership ideas that might be walking in your organization? And if so, how can leadership science, which I'm going to talk about the latest evidence, guide you forward, guide you away from that traditional zombie notion of leadership? Before I jump into that, as an academic, it would be remiss of me not to start without a definition of leadership. Now, there's a joke in academic circles that there are more definitions of leadership than people who have attempted to define the term. But nevertheless, over recent years, there has been some convergence on this idea of what leadership is. And there has been some convergence around this idea that leadership is an influence process. It's where one or more people influence or motivate one or more other people in order to achieve some sort of collective goal. And I think this idea of leadership is particularly important or particularly effective in large and complex organizations where we have large groups of people coming together, led by smaller groups of people trying to achieve an overall and collective aim. So let's unpack this zombie narrative, the what I've called the dead ideas. That's actually not my term. It's from a paper that Haslam and colleagues did last year. And they broke down zombie leadership into three main components. This idea that leaders deserve their exalted position because they have special and distinct qualities. So these leaders have qualities that are separate and unique than the masses. And it is those qualities that gives them the right and I guess the effectiveness to lead. The second part of that narrative is that success, so when organizations thrive or when they fail, is directly attributed to the leader. So when we succeed, we give the leader some bonuses and we say, thank you very much. And when they fail, we go, we're really sorry, but we've got to let you go. And the third aspect of zombie leadership is this idea that the masses, us plebs, so to speak, are incapable of looking after ourselves without the hand of a leader to guide us. This idea that we cannot self-organize. We need someone at the top in order to direct, guide, nurture, etc., groups of people forwards. Now, you may think, well, we don't have zombie narratives in our organization, and that may be true. But here's some evidence that helps me think that this idea of zombie narratives of leadership are still alive and well in many organizations. We pay chief execs on average 400 times the average worker, and that's increasing. And the rate of that differential is increasing. There's an increasingly asymmetric relationship between CEO pay and organizational outcomes. That's also evident in my world, in academia. It's not quite as great. It's 16 times. However, that has increased quite significantly from 3 times in the year that I was born. So that's some evidence to say zombie narrative might be alive and well. But let's unpack it a little bit more. Let's unpack these 3 elements of zombie narratives. And I want to give you the evidence underneath each of these 3 narratives to help you understand why this might not be the case. Let's look at a job that has been there actually for hundreds of years. It's the same job, the President of the United States, and it's a well-documented job. So we have a raft of data that we can look at about how the various people who've conducted this position have gone about that and also the outcomes that they've achieved. The interesting thing about this particular job is there's convergence between academics and historians and politicians or politician historians as well about who were the great ones and who the weren't so great ones. And the great ones are pretty clear. They're Washington, Truman, and Roosevelt. And that's great because knowing that difference between the greatness and the others means that we can then go a little bit more forensically and find out, well, what are those qualities that differentiate those great presidents from others? And that's precisely what researchers have done, except they couldn't find any common qualities. They looked at everything, all the individual characteristics, personality characteristics, and there is no single common characteristic that differentiates the good presidents from the others. In fact, the largest variance between good and bad presidents can actually be better explained by whether the country was at war during the time of their presidency, a completely external factor to the individual skills and qualities of a president. This is also evident in tech billionaires. You know, we may think sometimes that these billionaires are special and gifted people that have made these companies out of nowhere and led them into stardom. Or you may take the Malcolm Gladwell approach and go, there's a suspicious pattern going there with their dates of birth, or actually an even more suspicious pattern when you think about when they were doing university and what particular technologies were emerging at that time. So these 2 studies and many others like it have really debunked the idea that there are some special and significant or distinct qualities that differentiate leaders from the masses. There is one quality that does correlate between individual leaders and, I guess, greatness, and that's intelligence. However, it only at best accounts for 4% of the variation between good and bad leaders, which is hardly a large or important thing to promote for our purposes. So is success attributable to leaders? How can we understand this? So what several researchers have done is they've gone into organizations, they've gone into successful organizations, and they've said what contributed to success. They've interviewed all the people within the organizations and they've said, who was it? What was it? What was it that contributed to that innovation, that rapid business growth? They've done this in sports teams, they've done this in organizations, and there's some common factors here. One of them is that incredibly rarely do people say it was the leader that guided us forward. Instead, they more commonly say it was an experienced colleague or a new colleague who came with a radical idea. And that was the idea that we tried, and that is what propelled us forwards as an organization. This is also evident in Boris Groberg's study of stars, he looked at the organizations who poached high-performing talent from other organizations. And these organizations, they only poached the leader. They didn't poach the leader and the team around them. And what they found that actually by poaching those leaders actually performed below average in their organization rather than above average as expected. So this idea that it was the leader that might be the cause of the greatness at the other organization might be not quite true, or a little bit defunct. And the last one is that the masses are incapable of looking after ourselves or themselves. And there are a raft of stories about very successful, very agile, very innovative organizations that have sprung up out of nowhere without the hidden hand of a leader. And my own research on organizational change has shown that change that involves the participants and where participants contribute to the success in a bottom-up style is far more effective, far more successful than where leaders try and lead the change solely top-down. So together, this idea that leaders have distinct qualities, that success is attributable to a leader, and that the masses need a leader is essentially not supported by evidence. So what does that mean for you? I'd urge you to think and to pause and to say, how do we frame leadership in our organization? Do we assume that leaders are different? Do we assume that success is only attributable to the leaders? Do we assume that people cannot look after themselves? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, I think you might need a new narrative of leadership. So if there is some zombie narrative, then the next question comes, what can we do about it? What's a new narrative or a better narrative that we can use to frame leadership? And to do that, we really need to go back to basics. We really need to go to the same slide that I presented earlier, but ask a slightly different question. Where does leadership happen in organizations? So following on from this research where academics have gone in and said, well, who contributes to leadership? Try and understand some of those mechanisms. Try and understand why it was that that person stepped forward and led a colleague and that action, that instance and that moment then translated into organizational success. And how do leaders then create those environments? And so what this research has found and what's come together in this research is an idea that leadership is a little bit more complicated than some of these traditional zombie notions of leadership. And it's more complicated in two ways. It's actually multi-directional, or two different vectors of development that have come out of the research. One is, some people call this horizontal and vertical development. One of the vectors, or the horizontal vector, is skill set development, and the vertical development vector is mindset development. And let me explain a little bit about how those two vectors work, or what they mean in terms of developing along those two vectors. Let's start with the horizontal dimension. The journey here is really from the skills that allow a leader to show up and to, I guess, direct others, so what we call I leadership, and developing those skills from I leadership to we leadership, or being able to, rather than direct teams, but promote teams, create environments where people can come together and they can thrive. Let me tell you a little story that might explain that a little bit better. In the 1970s, NASA put a team together to study plane crashes. Specifically, what they looked at and what they noticed was that human factors were starting to become the biggest cause of plane accidents. So they put pilots in a simulated flight deck and they simulated crashes. They did this over 1,000 times, and they looked at how pilots and their crews responded in those critical few seconds after an incident on the plane, and then what that led to, either a crash or saving the plane. What they noticed in their study were that there are essentially two types of pilots. There was the stereotypical I pilot, the take charge pilot, the pilot who read the situation and said, this is what I think we need to do, and then directed the response to the incident. Those pilots, more often than not, crashed the plane. The other type of pilots were we pilots. Before acting, they paused. They said to their colleagues in the cockpit, this is what I read of the situation. What is it that you read? What is it that you see? And that simple act of pausing and engaging in dialogue and engaging the thinking of their co-pilots and flight controllers and crews, more often than not, saved the plane. And this is what we're talking about with this skill set development, the advancement from the leadership is about me to the leadership is about the group and how that group comes together to achieve outcomes. That's the horizontal development direction. The vertical development direction is about how people think. And this has come from adult development psychology and this idea that as we go through life, the way in which we think evolves. It becomes more complex. There are many layers to this evolution, but the two that are most pertinent in the leadership sense are expert thinking and strategic thinking. Strategic being thinking, also being systems level thinking. So expert thinking is the type of thinking where leaders tend to think in a quite linear and quite simplified way. They tend to think that there is prior knowledge that can be studied and understood and then applied to future situations. This is quite helpful for doctors and nurses and things like that. This is exactly what we want. But the problem with that type of thinking is that in complex organizations, which organizations are increasingly becoming, the likelihood that we will meet a challenge that we have met in the past and therefore can study the past response and apply it to the future is actually incredibly low. Increasingly, the challenges are more complex, they're more interrelatable, they're more tangled, they're more paradoxical. And what that needs, what those contexts need, is thinking that can embrace multiple sources of truth, thinking that it can embrace the expert opinion, but can also study the patterns, study the social side of the system and also the technical side of the system, and bring together a pattern or an understanding, and that they can make sense of that complexity in a way that then simplifies it and motivates others to act. That's often done through metaphor, where leaders are able to distill that complexity into a powerful statement of purpose, a metaphor, or a comparison that helps give that clarity to others, and in doing so provides motivation. There's an interesting study of chief executives of startups, and they looked at the experts and the strategic thinkers. Unsurprisingly, the experts were very successful in the early stages of a startup, but completely failed later on. But those experts who are able to develop their thinking and foster strategic thinking were almost 100% successful in leading their organizations through growth. So this kind of two-dimensional approach naturally lends itself to a 2x2. What we've got here in the bottom left-hand corner is actually the zombie leadership. These are the leaders who direct others through their knowledge. On the right-hand side, we've got the relational leaders, the we leaders. And as we go up the scale, we've got the more systems thinkers, the leaders that can sit back and spot the patterns and then act at that pattern level in order to guide the organizations forward. And the top right is actually where groups of people come together to steward or steer organizations through the complex landscape that they face. What we know is that as we go up each of these two vectors, these two dimensions, that the correlation between these skills and capabilities and mindsets and outcomes increases quite dramatically. So more strategic thinkers are more likely to lead organizational success, and we leaders are more likely to lead collaboration, innovation, problem solving, and group level outcomes. What does that mean for us? Well, the sad thing is that zombie leadership narrative forms most of our narrative thinking studies of leadership. Unfortunately, also, zombie leadership narrative is 95% of what's taught in most modern MBA programs, according to Chance and all. What's the narrative in your organization? And where does it fit in one of these four boxes? How do we frame leadership? Do we, for example, promote the best expert and put them into a leadership position? Do you, for example, in an interview for a leadership position, ask a potential candidate what's their first 100-day plan, which promotes I thinking and not we thinking? What is it that we look for when we're promoting leaders? Do we look for leaders with skills, individual skills, or do we look for leaders who are able to bring groups together and help them collaborate for outcomes? These are the types of questions which will help you understand where in your organization your leadership narrative fits. Therefore, what types of leaders are you promoting in your organization, and the likely influence of that leadership on organizational outcomes. I urge you to think about this. I urge you to think about where your organization sits. What are the predominant narratives? Which boxes do they form? Which narratives might you want to try and reduce or get rid of? And which narratives might you want to embrace? Guiding that journey is not a black box. There are a multitude of frameworks that will help you guide a mindset maturation journey or a skill set advancement journey to we leaders. One of these is action logics, which is you can read about in one of the top 10 HBR articles on leadership called The 7 Transformations of Leadership. It was written in 2005. This is not new science, but it describes the progression or the adult development pathway between different forms of thinking, different layers of thinking, different mindsets, and specifically provides a way of measuring where leaders are at in their mindset, with their mindset, and giving a template or a framework and a scaffold for developing leaders from, for example, experts to strategists, which we know strategists are much more highly correlated with better organizational outcomes. On the horizontal dimension, promoting we leadership, there are, again, a raft of frameworks and ideas and thinking out there. One that I particularly use, it's not mine, I'm not promoting it, but it's from the Center of Creative Leadership based in the US. And they use a framework called direction, alignment, and commitment. This idea that leadership happens when groups come together and share a common direction, are aligned to meet that aim, and have a shared motivation or commitment. And that when those three things happen when those three things happen between members of the team, rather than from leader to team, it is this between the members of the team coming together of direction, alignment, and commitment, which is where the magic of leadership happens. And that in itself shifts the narrative of leadership, because it becomes less of the job of the leader to define exactly what that direction, alignment, and commitment mean, and more of the job of the leader to create the environment with which people can come together and discover those three elements. And again, there are a variety of mechanisms that you can use to measure and quantify direction, alignment, and commitment, or relational leadership. There's a psychological safety scale, leader-member exchange, DAC survey, team learning outcomes. These types of measures work at a team level, meaning that what we're doing is surveying teams to understand how well they are working together. These are much more effective than culture surveys because they give a direct understanding of how teams, or the health of how a team's engine is functioning, and therefore give data to allow leaders to then improve or intervene. So, what is the right stuff? What I hope is that I provoked you to think about three things. What are those zombie narratives that might be in my organization? And what do I need to do to remove some of them? But also thinking around, what is the mindset of my leaders? And where do I need that mindset to be? And thirdly, how does your organization foster we leadership? Meaning, how do we create leaders that promote self-leading teams that collaborate for outcomes? Now, I'm sorry I can't be there in person to deliver this presentation. I'm actually in Copenhagen. I am welcoming questions, and I understand that there'll be an app or a way for people to ask questions. And I'll be waking up at about 3 p.m. your time, and I'll be back online then. And I look forward to responding to your questions and queries and your curiosity about some of the provocations in this presentation. Thank you very much.